Welcome back, people. You already know it's me, Bryce from Develop Mindfully, and let's continue writing our CSV to map web app. So just to recap on where we left off last time, we had just finished writing the JavaScript code for the CSV import process. We read the file, we parsed it, and we stored the field names and data in the browser's local storage. So now we're moving on to the select fields step. And just to give you a preview of what this looks like, I'm just going to quickly import a sample file here. If I import, so you can see that we have kind of a bunch of input controls here. So essentially what we need to do is we need to populate these drop downs with the headings from our CSV file, as well as these data fields down here. And what this is going to do is let the user pick specific fields related to the geocoding process, and then also associate any data fields with each location as well. And that'll make more sense as we get into writing the code. So let's get started by writing some functions to populate these fields here. So back in our main index.js file, we began defining the click listener when we left off last time, leaving this condition empty for if a CSV file has been selected. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to call our function to navigate to the select fields section. So we're going to go to fields section. And we also need to call a couple other functions first before we actually go there to interact and populate the drop downs and checkboxes. So let's write those now. So in our interactions folder, we're going to create a new file called fields.js. And we're going to open that up. We're going to import jQuery first of all. And then we're also going to import our store and retrieve functions for storing data in local storage. There we go. All right, so we're going to define a function called Populate Geocoding Fields. It's not going to take any parameters, but we are going to retrieve our fields that we stored after parsing our CSV file. So we're going to retrieve fields. So this function is going to populate our geocoding fields, which are the 5 drop-downs that correspond to the address components. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to retrieve the array of field names. So we have our field names. So now we're going to save the field configuration in an object called config, which will separate the geocoding fields from the data fields, and this will also be saved in local storage just so we can use it as needed. So by default, for the geocoding fields, we're just going to select the first entry from the fields. So we're going to take element 0, do this for city, and now for the data fields, we're actually just going to leave this as an empty array for the time being. So lastly, we need to actually create the option elements that are going to populate our select inputs. So the way we're going to do that is with jQuery, and we're easily going to just select the raw HTML text, and within a loop, we're going to actually create these elements one at a time. So if we loop over our fields, use for each, our field is passed in from here. So we're going to create an option by, like I said, selecting the raw text, the HTML element, and then we're going to give it a attribute with a value of the field name, and we're also going to give the text within the option element to be the same field name. Then we just have to actually append the element to each of our inputs. So we're going to select the IDs of all 5 inputs. I'm just going to copy and paste this string just for the sake of time. And when we select that, we will append our option element. So we'll save that. And I'm just going to apply some quick formatting just to clean this up a little bit here. Okay, now we're going to write a function that will actually update our config object when we actually pick an item from the dropdown. So we're going to write a new function called setGeocodingField, and that'll take passing in the name of the geocoding component and also the field name. And we can update our config object. So the way we would do that is just by simply retrieving it first of all. And then within the config object, same format as here, we're going to call fields and then geocoding name, so affecting the name attribute of the geocoding object, and we will set that to be the field name. And then we'll store our updated config object in local storage, and it will be updated. Alright, so now we want to also populate our data fields. And again, these are the checkboxes, which are designed as switches that will be showing up here. And they're just optional bits of information that we want to attach to the locations that aren't related to the components of the address. So we're going to make, again, a new function, and we're going to call this one populate data fields. So I'm going to take any parameters this time. But we are going to grab our fields from local storage, and we're also going to grab, we're also going to grab our config object from local storage. Now we're going to create a copy of the array of field names using the spread operator, and we're going to store that in a new array called data fields. So this is the spread operator here. And it's just going to create a copy of that array. And we're also going to retrieve the geocoding fields. And we're going to do this by using the values method of object. And what this is going to do is just going to take all of the keys from, the values from our object and put them into an array. And it's going to be from our config geocoding fields. All right, and so basically we're going to assume that any fields that aren't used in the geocoding dropdowns are all optional fields. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually loop over our geocoding fields using the for each function again, passing in v, which is the value of the geocoding field, and we're going to use the find index method on data fields. So again, this is the raw copy of our data fields, and we're going to find an index for a field that is equal to the geocoding field. So just to break this down again into simpler terms, so we're looping over the geocoding fields and we're looking within our copy of all the fields and finding the index of each one. So we're starting with the whole set of fields and we're going to remove the geocoding fields from it. So if as long as the index is not equal to -1, if it was equal to -1, that would mean it wasn't found. If it was found, then we want to use the splice method on our data fields array, and we want to actually remove it from the array. So it's just a simple way of taking our copy of all the fields and removing the geocoding fields from it. It looks a little confusing, but just roll with it for the time being. So now our array will contain only the fields that weren't using for any of the geocoding address components. So now let's just update the data attribute of our config fields object. So config.fields.data is equal to data fields, and then we're going to actually update again that config object. So as you'll see later, we'll be calling this function to update the list of data checkboxes every time that we change one of the geocoding dropdowns here to remove that selection from the list. So because of that, when we create the new checkboxes, we want to actually first remove them all by clearing out all the HTML in the parent container. So an easy way to do this is just to select that data fields container. We're going to do that now and use the HTML method and then just pass in a empty string, and that's just going to empty out all the content for us. So now we're going to go through and we need to actually create each checkbox. And once again, we're going to use our data fields. We're going to use for each to loop over all of them. And we're going to start by creating a container around the checkbox, which we'll call switch, since we're using Bootstrap's switch styling for these checkboxes. So we're going to select a new div to make, and we're going to give it a class attribute of, let's see, I'm just going to copy and paste it here. It's just some classes from Bootstrap to give it that really cool switch look. All right, and then we're going to create a input element. This is going to be the actual checkbox that exists behind the scenes. And we're going to give this a class as well. It's going to be called custom control input. I'm going to give it a type attribute of checkbox. We're going to give it a name attribute as well, and the name is going to be actually the field name. And we're going to give it an ID attribute as well, which will also just be the field name. It's going to get a property of checked set to true. We want them all to be, the switches to be on by default. We're also going to give it a change property here at the end. And we're going to circle back and define this after. And finally, we're going to create a label element as well to go next to each checkbox. So we're just going to select a new label element here. Going to give it a class of custom control label. I'm going to give it a for attribute as well, just to link it to the actual input, and we'll match it obviously to field since that's the name, the ID, and also within the text within it will actually be the field name as well. Now we just have to actually append the elements together. So we're going to take our switch element, we're going to call append, we're going to add the input to that, and then we're going to also append the label. So the switch again is just acting as the parent, and then underneath we're going to have a input, which is the checkbox, and then also a label element. Then finally, under that, we're going to take that switch and actually append it to the container of all the data fields. So the container of all the different checkboxes. Just like that, all within our loop. Now we do have to write a couple of functions to define what happens when we do flip that switch, which is that change event listener that we skipped earlier. So we're going to come down here and we're going to create a new function again. We're going to call it remove data field. It's going to take a field name. So by default, we want all of our switches to be on when they're populated. So that's the way that we did it, setting checked to true. So if the user flips the switch to turn it off, we want to actually remove the field from the array of data fields in our config object. So we're going to first retrieve our config object as usual. And then we're going to loop through, and we're going to try to find the index of the field that matches the name of the one that we flipped. So find index of the field, and if the field within the group of all the data fields is equal to this field name that we passed in, then we're going to find it. So if the index does not equal to -1, means that we actually did find it and we have the index of the element. We're going to go to our config object, fields in our array of data fields, and we're going to actually splice out that index, so deleting that element from the array, and then once again storing our config object just to update it. Now if the user flips the switch to turn it on, then we want to actually do the reverse and add the field to the array this time. So we're going to write another function to do that. We're going to call it add data field. We're going to pass in the field name as we did before, and going to retrieve once again our config object. This time it's going to be easier. So we look for our fields and then our data fields, and we want to push on just that field name to our array, easy peasy, and then store the updated config object once again. Awesome. So now if we're going back to our change event listener here, basically what we're going to do is write some conditions. So what we're going to say is if this checkbox is checked, the change that just occurred, it was just checked off, meaning the switch is on. We want to add the data field, and to get the field name, we're just going to take the actual name attribute from this element that the change is being called upon. So grabbing it using this handy function here. And otherwise, we want to remove the data field, meaning that the switch was turned off or the checkbox was unchecked. So the same thing, going to provide the name attribute from the current element. Awesome. So now we're just going to define one more function, which will disable all of the relevant fields and buttons in this form when we're ready to move on to the next step. So we're just going to make a function called setFieldsDisabled. I'm going to pass in a Boolean here for whether the form should be disabled or not, and I'm just going to copy and paste these statements in here. So just to walk you through quickly, we're selecting all the form control elements, all the custom input elements, and then also our import return button, the back button that we see here, and also our plot button here as well. So we just want to apply disabled with the Boolean that's passed in, so we can use this to either disable or re-enable all the fields in this form. Alright, and I'm just noticing we actually made a mistake a little bit earlier when we were defining our config object here. So you can see how I have an object that just has two attributes, geocoding and data. I forgot to actually wrap this in the fields object as well. So these actually exist within the fields object like this. So we're just going to save that. Alright, and then we're going to switch over to our index.js file, and the first thing we need to do before even reaching the select field section is we want to populate our geocoding and data fields. So we're going to call our methods here now. This will take care of the auto input for us. So populate geocoding fields, and we also want to call populating data fields, which is followed by our navigation function here, which will actually take us to the next section. So we'll save this and see if our population functions are working. Perfect. So we can see now we have all of our drop-down values and our data field switches populated. So now we're ready to start defining things for our select field section. So the first thing we're going to want to do is actually disable the default behavior on our fields form, which wraps all of these inputs together. We don't want it to submit in the same way that we would to an API endpoint or to some server-side code. So we're just going to define our own behavior when clicking the plot button. So to easily disable it, we're just going to call the jQuery submit function, and we're just going to call on the event prevent default and also stop propagation. Great. And now we also want to select all of our drop-downs and add a change event listener. So the way we're going to do that, I'm just going to copy and paste the string just to save time. but it's basically a long selector separated by commas, all the different IDs of our input elements. So on this, I'm going to call our change. I'm just going to take a function as a callback. And in here, we're going to call our set geocoding field function. And this is, of course, going to accept both the name of the field and the value associated. And we can grab that from the current input that we're working with by using the jQuery selector and passing in this. And again, this has to be done within a actual function, which will define the scope of this to be the callback itself. And not, if we used an arrow function, this wouldn't work the same way. It's very important. So using, in this case, the function keyword to actually define this. And we're going to call, we're going to grab our attribute name from this, the current element that we're working with, and use the this keyword again to pass in the actual value that's selected as well. And then finally, we also want to update our after setting the geocoding field, we want to actually update the data field switches that follow underneath. So we're going to call our populate data fields function. And this is going to basically clear them out and start again. There we are. We can see if I use one of these, we'll see suddenly that that value disappear from the list of data fields, which is what we want, and we'll see why in a little bit. Then moving on, we want to define our click event listener for our plot button. So we're going to do that by selecting the plot button, calling the click function, and passing in our callback here. And we want to also validate our form since we're not submitting it. We're going to handle that on our own. And we're making it so that kind of all of the fields here, the geocoding fields, are required because they're important for converting those addresses to actual latitudes and longitudes. So we're going to do a simple condition here. And we're going to select the fields form. I'm going to call get 0. It's going to call the first element within that selector. And we're going to call check validity. And then we're also going to have an else condition. So if it is valid, we will execute this code, and if it's not, then we will execute this code. And so if the form is invalid, we want to actually add a class here. In Bootstrap, when you add this class, was validated, it will check if the field is null by any chance, and if it is and it's marked to be required, it's going to be highlighted in red, and it's just going to reflect that it needs to be completed. But if the form is valid, then we're going to proceed with the geocoding process. So just in case you've never heard the term geocoding before, I mentioned it briefly. This refers to when we actually convert an address into its associated geographical coordinates, meaning the latitude and longitude. So Google provides an API for us to do this easily. And once we do this, we'll be able to create our map in the next step and plot the locations properly on that map. So we want to start here by disabling the form while the geocoding is taking place. So we're going to call our function called setFieldsDisabled. And now we also have a progress bar that's going to be shown kind of down here in this region. And it's going to be showing the percentage of geocoding that's been completed, and we'll be storing that value in our local storage. So to initialize that, we're going to be calling store progress and setting that to 0. We'll initialize that here. And we also have a couple more functions to define for modifying and incrementing our progress bar. So let's write those now. So under our interactions folder, we're going to make a new file called progress. And in this file, we're going to start by importing jQuery. And we're going to continue on to import our store and retrieve functions for working with local storage. It's going to come from our utils and storage. And we're going to make a function called increment progress bar. This is going to take a certain increment as an argument. So we will then make sure that the progress bar is visible. So we're going to call the progress bar container. We're going to select the container element, and we're going to call show on that. And then we're going to retrieve the figure for our progress next. So we're going to call retrieve on our progress that we just defined. And remember, in the other file, we actually defined it as 0 to start, as you'd expect. And then we're going to take our progress, and we're going to add that increment value that we pass in as an argument. So then we need to actually manipulate the progress bar, firstly by its width. So we're going to select the progress bar itself, progress bar, and using the CSS method, we're going to define the width. We're going to give it a width value in the CSS, and we're going to pass in that progress value. So we're going to put in progress, and then we're going to call the toFixed method because we just want it to be to the first decimal point, like that. And we're going to put a % as well. So it's going to occupy this percentage of the width of the container element. And then finally, we also just need to provide, we're going to put some text over top of the progress bar. So we're going to display the same value, basically, just the actual percentage itself. So the same thing, progress to fixed, just to the first decimal point, and then a % here. And lastly, we just want to store the updated value for the progress, since we did add the increment to it here. So we're going to store progress and pass in that new progress. All right, now we're going to create an additional function for clearing and resetting the progress bar. Once we're done working with it, we want to set it back to 0, just in case the user comes back to this step and begins geocoding again. So we can easily do that by first just resetting the value that's in local storage. So we're going to set progress to 0 using our store method. Then we're going to select the progress bar again, and we're going to reset that width value that's in the CSS, and we're going to set that to 0%. And then as you'd expect, as we did up here, we're going to also reset the text to 0% as well. So we're going to go to progress bar, use the text method, set it to 0%. And finally, we're also going to hide the progress bar entirely. So we're going to use that container element to do this, and we're going to call the hide method on it this time. Oh, and we're missing a $sign. Great, now with simple functions to dynamically change our progress bar, we can actually write the code for the geocoding process itself. Now before jumping into the code, there's an interesting dilemma with the Geocoding API that we'll be using to convert our location's addresses into coordinates. So Google has established these usage limits that allow for just a limited number of requests to the Geocoding API per second. And on top of this, we are making these requests asynchronously. And if we were to loop over our array of locations, the execution time combined with the request time does not allow us to easily predict if we are going to fall within that usage limit. So you can try this for yourself. If you try to call the geocoder in a loop without any intervention and print the response status, you'll see that while some results are successful, you will quickly begin hitting that usage limit, which will return a failure status telling you that you did reach it. So to get around this problem, I came across a solution that works with JavaScript promises and the set timeout function to introduce some delay to our calls in the Geocoding API, and thus greatly increasing our chances of actually staying within that usage limit time frame and getting successful responses. So Now, just as a disclaimer, this does mean that it will take a little bit longer to process our list of locations, but this is why we will be updating our progress bar to provide a visual cue to the user. Also, if you plan on geocoding a large data set, it's super important that you review the usage and billing documentation for the Geocoding API, and if you're comfortable with any costs that you may incur using Google's service. So let's get into the code. We'll first save this file, and then we're going to go to our source folder in our JavaScript folder, and then we're going to create a new folder called data. And within this, we're going to create a new file called geocode.js. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import our increment progress bar method that we just wrote. Now we're going to create this function called Geocoder Promise. It's going to take these arguments. I'll explain these as we go. And it's going to return a promise, which within it will have a callback, resolve, and reject being the two arguments that are supplied. Right, so, oh, sorry, missing a bracket there. Okay, so this function will return a promise. So a promise in JavaScript, if you're not familiar, is an object that represents an asynchronous action that is not necessarily completed yet, and the value associated with that action. So a promise accepts two functions in the callback, and we supply it resolve, which we will call and pass some data to when the action succeeds, or reject, which we will call if the action fails. So for now, try not to overthink this. I will provide a link to a great Mozilla article explaining promises. But think of this as a wrapper around our geocoding request, and we will use it to basically modify the request slightly and determine if the request succeeded or not. So as arguments that we passed in here, we have the geocoder from the Google Maps API, the address object, the increment, which we'll use for the progress bar, and also a certain number of seconds. So now within our promise, we want to wrap our logic in the set timeout function. And the interval, so we pass this a callback where we will define some actions, and then the interval, which is the second argument that we have here. It's just the amount of time in milliseconds. So we want to take our seconds argument and multiply it by 1,000 to get it into milliseconds. Now, and again, the reason why we're doing this, the whole set timeout thing, is because of the API usage limitations that I just explained earlier. So by creating some delay between our requests, we can almost guarantee that we're going to keep large enough gaps of time between requests and get successful responses without hitting that limit. Now, within our set timeout callback, we're going to actually use the geocoder object from the Maps API, and we're going to use the geocode method. So the first argument is going to be an object that with what data that we want to use. So we want to specify an address, and we want to supply the address string property of our object. Address string. And then the second argument for the geocode method is the callback, with what to do when the results of the geocoding process are returned, and also a status variable. So within here, we're going to create a copy of our object. So we're going to do that using the assign method. So we assign to an empty object a copy of our data object. And again, this data object is it just represents one record from our CSV file that we passed in, right? So it's going to contain the address as well as this address string and data fields that are associated with the location as well. And we're going to set this lat-lang property on this object to null. This is the reason we created the copy of the object, so we can add this new attribute to it. We're going to set it to null. Now we're going to check if the status is equal to this special Google Maps constant in the constant of the type Geocoder status. If it's equal to this constant of OK, then we want to actually set the lat-lang attribute of this object. Now we could get more advanced with this solution by adding conditions to force the geocoding process to make new attempts if the geocoder status returns an error or a usage limit exceeded response, but we're going to keep it fairly simple for the sake of this tutorial. So if the status equals this constant here, meaning it's successful, we want to actually set our lat-lang coordinates. So since the results variable is an array, we're going to use a ternary to dig out the value, but we're first going to check that the results are not null and they're also not empty. So if we're going to check for a kind of a falsy value here, and we're also going to check results length is greater than 0. So if this is the case, in our ternary we're going to say use the first record in the results array, and we're going to access the geometry of that result, and then we're going to access the location. And if we don't have this, then we're going to say set it to null. And finally, once this is done, we want to increment our progress bar. So we're going to call our function for that and pass in the increment variable. And then finally, we're going to return resolve for this promise. So it's going to resolve the promise, passing in our completed data object, even containing the lat-lang coordinates, to the callback for the promise. Now you may have noticed that we're not calling the reject function under any condition, and once again this is because for simplicity's sake we're not going to implement any functionality for reattempting a failed geocode request. So you probably saw this address string attribute in our Geocoder Promise and wondered where that came from. So at this point we have our geocoding fields that are mapped to specific column headings from our CSV file, but we do need to transform our row objects to be grouped together into a more useful structure. So we're going to go and create a new function, and we're going to call it transform. And it's going to accept raw data as an argument. We're also going to want to import our retrieve function from our local storage. So we're going to do that now. Storage. Right. So within our transform function, the first thing we want to do is we want to grab our config object that we set up earlier. Then from our config, we want to also store the geocoding fields. So we're going to grab that by accessing the fields and then geocoding from within our config object. We're going to do the same thing, grabbing the data fields. config.fields.data. Now we're going to we're going to map this array to a new transformed array. So we're going to return raw data, and we're going to call the map function on that, since that's going to return a new array. And within there, we're going to define a callback, which will execute the transformations. So we'll start by creating a new object. So we'll call this address object. And this object will have standardized attributes for the address components. And we'll use the current data object D, and we'll use square brackets and the corresponding field in our geocoding fields to grab the value. So we're going to, for each one, we're going to take street address, and we're going to provide city, province, postal code, and country. So we're going to take from our geocoding fields the address. Remember, we stored this earlier. And we're going to do the same for each of these remaining things. And again, the whole reason that we're doing this is so that we can create an object that we expect in a standard format, regardless of the field name from the user's data. Just creating a higher level of abstraction, and we don't have to worry about name conflicts or anything like that. Now we need to create a new utility to get a string form of the address for our geocoding process. So we'll save this, and under our utils folder, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call that string.js. Now this is going to, so we'll define a function called address as string, and this is going to accept as an argument the type of object that we just defined. So it's going to have these properties that we expect. So we're going to add those here. So, and we're just going to return a string, and we're going to use ES6's template literals to reference our variables all within a set of backticks. So this is an easy way to flatten our address object into a simple string format. So we're going to access first the address, which will separate by a comma, followed by the city, which will add another comma after, followed by the province, and then we're going to add the postal code right after the province without a comma, and then one more comma followed by country. Now switching back to our geocode file, we're going to import this function now. Address as string. So we're going to pass, back in our body, we're going to pass in our address object into this function that we created. Save the result in this address string variable. And now we're going to create a new variable called data. We're going to make it an empty object. And then we're going to loop over our optional data fields that have been selected. And for each of those, we're going to take the heading and specify the value from our raw object D. So for each of these data fields, the F represents the obviously the field name, which would be the heading. For example, over here we have data A, data B, data C. So we're going to, within our new empty data object, we're going to use square brackets, and we're going to supply the attribute name F. And we're going to assign the value of that same data field in the current data object, which comes from D up here. So now we're going to have basically a object that consists of the data fields that we selected, the attribute being each of those data fields, and then the actual value for that field as well. And finally, we're going to return all of this in a new object containing just the address object for the raw components, the address string, and then finally any data associated with the location. Awesome. So now let's use this transform method and our Geocoder Promise to wrap up our whole geocoding process. So we'll go back up and create a new function called Geocode, and this is going to take a callback. And the first thing we're going to do in here, now that we've done the heavy lifting in the other functions, we're going to start by just grabbing our raw data from local storage. So call retrieve data. And we're going to pass, we're going to store, we're going to call our transform function with the raw data and store this in a variable called data. Then we instantiate the geocoder object. call it new google.maps.geocoder. Then we're going to calculate the increment by determining the percentage of one item to be geocoded, and we do that by just using the length of our data array. So 1 out of the total length of the number of elements times 100. And now we're going to create a new array called promises, and as you could expect, it's going to be an array of our geocoder promises. And so for each data item that we have, we want to call our geocoder promise function. So we're going to do that, and we're going to push it onto the array of promises. So we're going to call that Geocoder Promise, and we're going to pass in the reference to the geocoder itself. We're going to pass in the data object here, D. Then we're going to pass in the increment value, and we're going to pass in I, which is just the current increment of the loop. So notice that we're passing in this variable I. This is the argument, remember, that is the number of seconds to display. So this means we are essentially reserving 1 second for every geocoding request and trying to stay within those API usage limits. For larger quantities of data, you may want to adjust this or create a more dynamic waiting and reattempt process. But again, just for the sake of this tutorial, a 1 second window should work quite well for us. So those promises are all going to be created within that loop, pushed onto the array. And then we're going to, using the actual promise object, we're going to use the all method and pass in our array of promises. And once all of our geocoding requests are complete, we're going to use this to take some action. And we're going to do that by using the then. We're going to chain the then function to it. And that's going to have our completed geocoded data here, and we're going to take some action with that. Now we're going to then use our callback that's supplied to this geocode function, and the callback is going to take null for error, and then we're going to actually pass in the geocoded data here. But we also want to filter out any geocoded objects where the lat-lang coordinates were not actually supplied to us. So we're going to basically use the filter function on our array, and if the lat-lang, we only want to keep the ones where the lat-lang does not equal to null. You can actually remove the curly brackets here because it's just one statement. And then we're also going to chain the catch method in case there's a rejection or any other error in our set of promises. So it's going to return the error to us, and then we would call our callback in that case, passing the error in, and then we would have null for the geocoded data that would be returned. All right, so now if we return to our index.js, we'll import that function. And returning to our plot button, event listener. So we will call our geocode function, and in the callback, again, it's going to be either an error, and then also there would be the geocoded data that would be returned back. So in the body of our callback, we want to first check if there is an error. So if there's an error or there is a null value for our geocoded data, then we want to just return without taking any further action. And otherwise, we want to actually just store, we're going to update the data in our local storage with the completed geocoded data. Oh, and we're getting a little error there. Yes. See, I put it in a folder called data when I actually meant to put it in a folder called interactions. So we're just going to move it there. can delete. Oh, yep, we're going to do that. We will delete our data folder. Alright, and while we're here, we also want to define the behavior quickly for when we click the back button. So we're going to select the import return button, and we're going to define a click event listener for that. And we're doing this because just in case someone wants to go back to the previous step and import a different file instead, they'll have the ability to do that with this return button. If we go back to our import.js file here, we're going to create a new function called reset import fields. And I'm just going to copy and paste this next section here, walkthrough H1. So it's going to take a look at the CSV file label, and it's going to reset the text back to this default text choose CSV file. It's going to make sure that the disabled, it's not disabled. It's going to reset the value of the file just in case there was any file left behind there. And then we're essentially going to do the same for the JSON file input as well, resetting the text, making sure it's not disabled, and clearing out any value that was there before. So I'm just going to save this. And then if I switch back to the index.js function, and I'm just going to import this here. Reset import fields. So in this click listener for the return button, we're just going to call that to reset the import fields, and then return to the import section as well. Alright, so that does it for this part of the tutorial. This was a long one today. We've completed the configuration process for selecting fields from our CSV file, and honestly this was pretty comprehensive, no small feat. We can now geocode our addresses that we assembled from the fields within our data, so great work. In the next and final part of the tutorial, we'll wrap up the actions taken when the geocoding is actually complete and move on to creating our map, and then toss in some other fun extensions to the project. So thank you so much for watching. If you're enjoying this tutorial, please support this video by clicking like, and also subscribe to Develop Mindfully if you'd like to see more. We'll see you in the next one.